You know, I've got to ask something, particularly of the Muslims now protesting on our streets and elsewhere, protesting against Israel. Aren't you embarrassed? Aren't you ashamed that in this war, that the Palestinian side is represented by Hamas, a bunch of murdering, raping, torturing terrorists? And is it a time that Arabs especially, Muslims generally, were represented by people who look civilized, who look peaceful, tolerant, modern, forward-looking, instead of looking like Hamas, medieval butchers? So I can't imagine that people think, no, the Hamas, why aren't there then demands to free Gaza, not of Israelis, but free it of Hamas? I really don't get it. Now, last night I talked to Jordan Peterson about a huge conference in London this week to launch his idea of a thing is called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. It's more power from the people and less for governments. Now, one of the key speakers there is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who fled Islamic Somalia to live in the Netherlands, where she became an MP. But she also suffered serious death threats. A friend of hers was killed, the director Theo van Gogh, for making a film attacking Islam's oppression of women. She now works for the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and is the author of the international bestseller Infidel, My Life, and her latest book is Prey, Immigration, Islam and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you on the show again. When you look at Hamas, at its slaughter of the Jews on October 7, and you now look at the huge anti-Israel protests around the world, like the one in London last weekend, where you are now, even a call to prayer close by Downing Street, blocking off the streets. What do you conclude? What message do you take from all of this?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised. I'm shocked. I'm always shocked by those images, but I'm not surprised because I spent the last 20 years talking about this and warning about this. And there's a small minority of us who grew up as Muslims in Muslim countries or in Muslim families. And we are united in what I call the Clarity Coalition. And for years, we've been saying, if we act on the belief system that Hamas subscribes to, or that ISIS subscribed to, or Al-Qaeda, or any of these very radical political Islamist groups, this is what you get. You get people who are saying they love death more than they love life. They call Jewish people pigs and apes. They dream about and they preach about killing Jews, cutting off their heads, raping their women, obliterating the state of Israel. These teachings and preachings, these ideas, these stories, they don't stay in the mosque. They come out into the streets, and that's what we are seeing. And it's not the first time we are seeing it. It's just that the scale is now larger.
Was this something that you were familiar with when you were growing up in Somalia? What were you told then about Israel and the Jews?
So I grew up in several countries, but as a teenager, I was going to school in Nairobi, Kenya. And we identified, I went to the Muslim girls' secondary school, and most of us in that school identified as Muslim, but we were not political. We were not even overtly religious. And then from one day to the next, we had a penetration of a movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. And there was some kind of Iranian activity. But with the Muslim Brotherhood came the doctrine of Hamas, that we saw ourselves not as Muslim individuals who worshipped God according to the Quran. We were basically, members of the Ummah, Muslims. And if you are a non-Muslim, our job as teenagers, as Muslims, was to try and convert the others. And if they refused, then we had to do what was in our means to bring them to destruction. And as a teenage student in a secondary school, in a high school, our job was to sit down and pray for their destruction. So I sat there with my fellow students praying for the destruction of the Jews and the Christians, but in particular the Jews. And when I reflect back on that time, I remember thinking, but where were the Jews? We didn't have any Jews that I knew of in our neighborhoods. I hadn't seen a Jew until I came to the Netherlands in 1993, and I went to a place called Antwerp in Belgium. That was the first time I saw Jewish people. But for years and years, I had been praying for their destruction. And even outside of the religious realm, my mother, for instance, when we lived in Saudi Arabia, we would open the tap and the water, when the tap starts coughing because there's no water coming out, her remark would be, oh, those Jews are at it again. And everybody would nod and sort of, affirm the fact that all things evil were caused by the Jews: lack of water, lack of food, diseases, political and economic turmoil. The Jews were behind it. And so that narrative of the Jews being evil and then finding excuses in the Quran and in Islamic scripture to unite and to mobilize to destroy them, that problem has only become bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what we are seeing now. And unfortunately, it's imported into the West. So what you're seeing in London 3 weekends in a row is that it's not only Muslims and Palestinians who grew up in Muslim households who were brainwashed into this poison, but they have along with them people on the left who should know better, who didn't grow up, but they don't have the excuse of being brought up in Muslim households. They are on the left. They call themselves queer. They call themselves Marxists or cultural Marxists. They call themselves climate activists. But there they are, united in London in the year 2023, shouting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And that is a call to genocide. That is a call to the obliteration of Jews. And these are people who are educated. I remember in 2001, 2002, in Europe, when we were discussing, what should we do about Muslims? They would say they should be educated. Well, here you have educated masses who are marching for the destruction of Jews.
And many of them would have fancied themselves as anti-fascists. They would have seen Hitler coming. They would have been on the front line. Here is a new form of Jew hatred, or new to them, and they embrace it. I can't believe it. But given all this, mass immigration, has the West assumed too lazily that no matter how many people it accepted, no matter how fast they came, no matter where they came from, that it assimilated in time? There was no need to worry about that kind of thing. In fact, we concocted a cult of multiculturalism to encourage people to keep their own cultures. What do you make of all that now?
I think it's been a crazy experiment, and it's turning out to be a crazy experiment. We have allowed people to come unconditionally without vetting them for what they believe or whether they will adopt our moral system, and by the masses. And we never asked them to adopt our moral system for decades and decades and decades. We have said they can have their mosques, they can have their madrasas, they can have their own TVs, they can have their own neighborhoods. And there we seeded, and it has grown, these intolerant ideas of radical Islam. And it's not. When I left and went to the United States in 2006, American scholars were talking about Europe as a lost cause because of immigration. But now the problem is in America. It is in American universities that kids are screaming, look at what's going on in Cornell and in other places, that Jewish minority students are feeling threatened. This is a new phenomenon, and it's growing. So if the problem is now in America, and I'm sure it's in Australia because I saw those images around the Sydney Opera House, and it's in New Zealand, and it is everywhere, then I feel we've gone down a terrible road that started with arguments for immigration being a good thing. And now here we are, and it's very, very difficult. I am pro-immigration. I am an immigrant, but I find it very difficult now to argue for immigration.
I find it quite frightening too. My parents were immigrants, but something has changed. Maybe it's also the fact that people can keep the contact with their culture quite easily in a way my parents couldn't. Easy internet access, cheap international flights, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. Plus, of course, the quantum makes a difference too. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, always fantastic to talk to you.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, when your pen, immigration was always selective, and immigrants, it was demanded of them, they assimilate, and we did it, yeah.
I'm afraid I'm out of time, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it.